All right, I want to welcome everybody. This is an event sponsored by the Foundations of Conflicts project with support from the George Life Center for the Political Future. I'm pleased to have Wilkinson here to bring to us his expertise and his standing to stand in the middle and be able to look at both sides of our political divide and talk to us about how urbanization plays a role in political polarization. And was going to talk for, I think, about 45 minutes. We're going to have questions as long as we're ready to go. And I think everybody's here both in person and remotely. And without further ado, we'll give Will a chance to get started. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm sure you don't know this. I think it was Mark. Was that your first TA?
My first TA.
I was his first TA, and I think the only person younger than me that I've TA'd for. So.
Sorry.
Yeah. I can't help it that Mark is a prodigy. Today, I'm going to give you a talk that draws from a paper that I wrote 2 years ago now when I was vice president for research at the Niskanen Center, which is a little think tank in Washington, D.C. See if I can get this into work. Paper was called The Density Divide, Urbanization, Polarization, and Populist Backlash. And the inspiration for this paper was the alarming election of Donald Trump in 2016. I think a lot of people weren't expecting that to happen. And once it did, people went casting about for an explanation. Like, so why did we end up with a real estate mogul and reality TV star as our president? And there were a lot of kind of competing hypotheses at the time. It was like the effects of globalization, the offshoring of jobs had, gutted manufacturing towns. There's some general explanations about just the alienating effects of neoliberalism, whatever neoliberalism amounts to. And I thought there was some merit in all of those competing explanations, but I thought there was something that was really being overlooked. I thought those things couldn't quite explain the patterns that were showing up in the election results. So just one of the crazy things about the 2016 elections was that there was this really, really strong correlation between population density and party vote share. And it's just such a strict correlation that it kind of boggles the mind. The more dense you get, the higher the population density gets, the higher the Democratic vote share goes. The lower the population density, the higher the Republican vote share goes. And so, if you start out in the densest part of any town, any city, that's going to be the most Democratic area. And if you aim your car kind of towards city limits, as the density goes down, Republican vote share goes up, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up until you get out in the country, and the density is like, it's as sparse as it gets, and then you get, overwhelming Republican vote share. And I'm just like, why is that happening? It's just a crazy thing to polarize on, it would seem to me. But it turns out it had been happening for quite a while. Right? So here is a chart that shows the kind of trend over time of the relationship between population density and vote share. So way back in 1916, you can see that there's just no relationship at all. You start to see it tick up. By 1960, there was a kind of emerging correlation. And then by 2016, there was a really, really strong correlation. And the correlation has only gotten stronger in the last election cycle or two. So it's something that's ongoing, even though I think that it's likely petering out because we might have gone as far as we can go. So this made me think about what is driving that trend. And one of the kind of remarkable things when you look at it over time is just the rate of urbanization, like how fast people are moving from the country to the city. And that is a really slow change. It's so slow that we don't really notice it. It's a background thing. It's kind of like tectonic, but like back in 1916, this was still a primarily agricultural economy, but the Industrial Revolution that started a couple centuries before, but like really got going in the U.S. in the 19th century, that started the process by which cities started to grow and grow and grow, and over time, the population of every place on Earth has drifted from the country to the city. And I'll show you a chart on that. And well, I'll just jump ahead. I don't really have a presentation. I just have charts that are illustrative. So this is a graph of the population who live in an urbanized area. So you can just see that it just explodes around 1800, and that's basically the start of the Industrial Revolution. And so the invention of manufacturing creates big gains to putting people together in one place to make stuff in a kind of mechanized, coordinated way, and it just shoots up, boom. And so this one is the United States here. And that goes to 2000. Here's another one in the US. This is the urban and rural population as a percentage of total population. So you can just see urban population grows, and this is a projection to 2050. So by 2050, it's going to be about 90% of the population lives in cities. We're at about 85% these days. We're a little over 80 here. All right, now when you think about that kind of change, there are a couple interesting possibilities. Where am I? If it turns out that urbanization hasn't happened uniformly, that there is selective migration to the city, and that the population is sorting itself on various relatively stable attributes, then that's going to kind of segregate the population on those attributes. And that became my initial thought. Well, that wasn't my initial thought. That was my kind of second conclusion. First, I started wondering, okay, if there's this big correlation between population density and partisanship, maybe it's that living in a city makes you really liberal, right? And that makes sense. That cities are diverse places. You're going to be exposed to, more different kinds of people, more ideas, different cuisines. And so maybe just the exposure to this diversity is going to have a liberalizing effect. And it does have a little bit of a liberalizing effect, but it really can't explain the strength of the connection, right? So that would be the treatment effect, right? That there's something about living in the country that makes you conservative, and there's something about living in the city that makes you liberal. And one of the things it can't explain is just the pattern of urbanization and the relationship between a party vote share and density. Now, when you have this long-term trend of people moving to the city and fewer people living in the country, then you start to think about, well, maybe it's selective. And that's what I arrived at, that the population become polarized on three main attributes that had an effect on sorting the population, and their ethnicity, personality, and education. I'll go through each one of those. But first, I want to just show you some interesting facts. So this is from a relatively recent paper, and this shows you where where the thing that I'm calling the density divide, the 50-50 vote share point, like where the majority vote share flips from majority Democratic to majority Republican. Counties turn from red to blue at about 700 people per square mile. Now that's not really that dense. So it's kind of anything that's kind of like between outer and inner suburbs, you know, houses with lawns, you know, they're not too far apart, but, you know, just like you're kind of like Leave It to Beaver kind of picture of a single family housing residential neighborhood. That's, you know, around 700 people per square mile. It gets, you know, way denser in a city like Los Angeles. Los Angeles is kind of sprawling, but it's actually very, very dense relative to most places. The densest place in the US is Manhattan, and it gets upward to, I think, 70, 80,000 people per square mile. So these are big differences, right? Like 700 per square mile is, you know, a big difference from, you know, 70,000 per square mile. So, you know, that gives you some reference about like what really dense is. And that's, you know, not that dense, but past 700 people per square mile, less dense than that, it starts to flip. And so you get, this is 2008, this is 2020. And you can see that, you know, the flip point kind of moved in. Right. And it's just nuts. I mean, it's weird, right? Like that they just completely diverge like that on this axis. So this has like kind of compounding effects. It's not just that it's sorting people on some attributes. It also is reflecting changes in the economy, right? The whole reason urbanization happens is that there is structural change in the larger economy. The you know, advent of manufacturing is the thing that kind of sets urbanization into motion, and each subsequent development has, you know, further effects. So like, you know, sometime in the 70s, 80s, economists say we kind of switched from a manufacturing economy to an information economy, and that kept increasing the gains to density economically. Like these days, it's not as intuitive because we've all like been on Zoom, and I work from home, you know, and so like I think there might be actually like a push in the opposite direction that you know, companies are starting to spread out a little again instead of just all becoming concentrated. But the trend over time has been for economic production to become increasingly concentrated in a relatively small number of cities. And they get concentrated because clusters of specialization have a higher economic output than other places. So LA is, you know, the entertainment cluster in the US. Like if you want to be an actor, if you want to be a director, if you want to be a gaffer or a best boy or whatever, you have to move here. This is where it is. And the productivity of all those people is highest in the place that specializes in that task, because everybody else is better at their job. It makes you better at your job. It makes you more efficient. If you want to be a computer programmer, if you want to be a coder, like moving to Silicon Valley is where you're going to be most productive. And so there's been these pressures for this kind of consolidation and concentration. And when you combine that with this, this effect of polarization on population density, you get some pretty surprising results in terms of the way that partisan vote share relates to regional economic productivity. Right? So this just shows you the trend between 2010 and 2016. So in 2010, in 2000, and these are great elections to compare, because these are both elections in which the winner didn't win the popular vote. So, you know, they're both really real squeakers. So they're nice comparisons. So in 2000, Al Gore won 659 counties, and those 659 counties accounted for 54% of GDP, of the, you know, aggregate economic output of the country. So just a little more than half. George Bush won many more counties because most counties are rural, right? Like when people are concentrated, you're fitting them more people in fewer counties. So 2,397, you had 46% of the economy, right? That's pretty even. Just a little bit tilted on the Democratic side. But that just breaks open in just these 16 years. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won fewer counties than Al Gore did, 472, but got 64%. Those counties accounted for 64% of GDP. So that's almost 2/3 with a smaller number of counties. So that just shows you how the economy is concentrating. Trump had 2,584 counties, he got 36%. And it got worse in the last election, partly because Biden picked off some of the kind of swing, suburban counties that Trump won, like Maricopa County in Arizona, like around Phoenix. And those are relatively high productivity places, right? So he brought some of those in. So won just slightly more counties than Hillary Clinton did, but the ones that he won are about 75% of the economy, right? So here you have a pretty resounding majority of the country. Hillary won by, what was it? What was the popular vote margin? Anybody remember? I forget what it was. 3 million? Yeah, 3 million, around that, like it's quite a bit. And that group of the American population, was producing about 2/3 of the economic output of the country. And, the minority that accounted for Trump's counties were producing 1/3, right? But they still won, right? And that seems like a weird circumstance when you have a minority of the country who's ruling over the urban majority that's producing the lion's share of the economic output. Right. And this economic divergence is part of the story. Now, I wanted to emphasize that, you might think this is a big city thing. It isn't. Like around 2008, like people, the red states versus blue states became a frame that people became really familiar with. But that's not really the way to think about things. States aren't really red states or blue states. It's just density all the way down. This is my hometown, Marshalltown, Iowa. It's a town of about 27,000 people. And you see the same pattern everywhere you go. The densest part is the most Democratic part. So these are Hillary Clinton majority precincts in Marshall County. And this is the old part of the city. That's the most dense part. Like older parts of town are denser because they're not built for cars, basically. That's why like cities like LA or Phoenix are so sprawling, because they're kind of developed initially to accommodate cars, but pre-car cities are really packed in the business district because people had to move around without automobiles. And you see like the whole part, where all the streets are, where Marshalltown is, a lot of these are just barely Republican majority, but they're still a lot less Republican than the surrounding area. This is from a map the New York Times did, and it's fascinating. You can zoom in all over the country, and anywhere in the country, you can find your hometown, and you see the same pattern anywhere. It has this kind of like fractal quality. And so it's not red states, blue states. It is just a function of how much of the state, what percentage of the state population is inside that density divide and what percentage is outside. Right? And like, if you want to do just like really simple election analysis, you can get a long way by just like drawing a circle around all of the cities at about the 700 people per square mile point, and just like taking the population from all those areas in the state and comparing it to the population in all the areas outside. And like, that's probably, it's a good first cut. Like there's very few places where that doesn't just predict who wins. So red states are just states that have a larger, whose lower density population is overall higher than its higher density population. California is one of the most urbanized states, so it's just overwhelmingly Democratic. One of the things that people miss in these things is that, and something I try to emphasize, is that we automatically, when we think about things being polarized on density or like the urban-rural divide, you start to think of like everybody in cities is liberal Democrats and everybody in the country is Republicans. That's not the way it is, right? There are more Republicans in Los Angeles County than in all of Iowa, which is a state that went overwhelmingly for Trump, right? There's over 1 million, I think about 1.2 million Republicans in LA. That's like more than the population of lots and lots of states. Like not lots of states, but like quite a few. There's only like 500,000 people in Wyoming, right? So there are a lot of Republicans here. It's just, they're just overwhelmed by the number of Democrats. And there are, of course, like Democrats who live in the country. It's just they're overwhelmed by the Republican population. All right. So the analogy that I like, that I think helps kind of helps you visualize how this sorting happens over time is, I like to think of, like imagine a table. We can just imagine this table right here. And like suppose we put like a really powerful magnet underneath it. And we had a bunch of ball bearings that are just spread around the table randomly. And some of the ball bearings are like iron and steel, things that are like super magnetic. And other ball bearings are things like, aluminum or I don't know, nickel or whatever. They just are not very attracted to magnets. And over time, urbanization is like the power of the magnet turning up. And so the ball bearings that are magnetic just gradually cluster toward the city, and the ones that aren't just stay put, right? They might get jostled around while the other ones are kind of knocking into them, and the whole thing kind of moves to the middle a little bit. But then everything that's left is like the aluminum and nickel ball bearings, right? Like they're the only ones out there, even though initially it was a completely random sort of collection. And it was kind of random when pretty much everybody lived in the country. So what are the attributes that are analogs to the kind of magnetism of the ball bearings we're imagining? So I mentioned it before: ethnicity, personality, and education. Ethnicity is probably the simplest one to understand. The United States is a majority white country, has been for a long time. Non-white Americans have, since the beginning of urbanization, clustered really heavily in cities for like a bunch of really simple reasons. One, it's just like safety in numbers, right? Like if you want to be around people like you, if you're just out in the country randomly distributed, you're going to be a minority, like a big minority. You're going to be surrounded by people who aren't like you. And if you just want to be people who are like you, who share your experience, you're probably going to need to go to a city. And that's, so ever since the Great Migration, after the end of the Civil War, African Americans just flocked en masse to big cities in the North, but also in the South, right? So that was the African American population was almost entirely rural because they were enslaved and forced to do agricultural labor. But that population, as soon as they were liberated, gravitated like immediately. It took time, like all of these things, but created these very large urban concentrations of population. And then immigrant communities as well tend to concentrate in cities. Like if you don't speak the language, you're going to want to move. If you're Vietnamese and you want to be around people who you can understand, you're going to see where are the most Vietnamese people and you're going to move there, right? And so there's a bunch of gateway cities for different ethnic groups. Like if you're from the Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, you probably move to the New York area. If you're Chinese, you're probably moved to California. That's the most popular destination, but there's a lot of other gateways. Texas is a popular immigration destination, Florida, and all of those places have really diverse populations. I did a Master of Fine Arts at the University of Houston, which I think is the second most diverse campus in the country, second to University of Central Florida. And it's because like there are these big clusters of immigrant communities in Houston, and that's kind of like the public university for immigrant kids, like for first generation immigrants. So like they're heavily concentrated there, and it's like there's no like Asian student union. There's like a Thai student union and a Vietnamese student union and a Chinese student union. So like all of those groups have flocked to these big gateway cities. And like, that's basically it. Like, the thing I skipped is one, just the reason urbanization happens at all, because that's where most of the jobs are. But then it's just like safety in numbers, familiarity. Now, just the preference for living around people like you explains a lot of patterns of migration, right? And minorities tend to be more ethnocentric than majority populations, partly because they're more likely to be persecuted or marginalized, and their shared experience, pushes them to identify with their ethnicity or background or nationality more heavily than the majority population, who's kind of like the default for the place, right? And so those groups have a stronger preference than the majority groups for living around people like them. Now, we're going to see that a big part of the difference that we get is a distinction among the American white population in the intensity of their preference for living around people like them. So that's just ethnicity, and it's not that complicated. I'm going to move on to my favorite. I keep pointing it at this, like that is the thing. While I was researching this, I got really, really into the literature on personality and the way it relates to geography. There's a whole like little subfield called, like psychogeography or geopsychology. I forget what they call it, but it's really cool. And you see that people with different personality types have different preferences for the kinds of places that they want to live. At the same time, and this is what got me onto it, years ago, I'd gotten into some of the political psychology literature that, why are people conservative? Why are they liberal? And there's some personality attributes that correlate with just general social liberalism, social conservatism. There's no relationship between personality and opinions on economic views. That's a complicated story why that is, which I won't get into. But there's a really strong correlation between a couple of the dimensions of personality and social issues. So the two that correlate with political opinions, with ideology like liberalism and conservatism, openness to experience and conscientiousness, these top two. Extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism just don't really have any notable significant relationship. The strongest by far is openness to experience. In some way, partly because it's kind of defined almost as social liberalism. And I won't get into the methodology of personality psychology, how they decide that these are the 5 dimensions. Do something called factor analysis to try to see where the clusters are, and try to get down to the minimum set of things that like don't overlap with one another. So these are 5 dimensions that are incredibly weakly correlated with each other, and that's why they seem to be independent. And that's the smallest number that they can get. So openness, here it's defined, this is out of one of the psychology textbooks and personality psychology textbooks, the tendency to be open to new aesthetic, cultural, and intellectual experiences. And it's almost hard to define openness like on a college campus, because like that is the ethos of universities. It correlates with a lot of things, like it's curiosity in a way, like intellectual curiosity, aesthetic curiosity, kind of cultural curiosity. So people who go and get graduate degrees are super likely to be very high in openness to experience because they become intensely curious about some subject. And especially, you know, people who go into the arts or humanities or like philosophy, they're like, whoa, you know, like, what is the solution to the problem of universals or something like it? And like, that is not something that like somebody who's low on openness ever would, you know, like, they'd just be like, who cares? And conscientiousness, tendency to be organized, responsible, and hardworking. This is weakly but significantly related to conservatism and liberalism. High conscientiousness is positively correlated with conservatism. And it's interesting, these are kind of different kinds of conservative and liberal dispositions. The conservatism of conscientiousness is probably, you're going to find more of it within the urban Republican population. It's like conscientiousness is the A student personality trait. It's like you want to know what's required of you. You want to know what marks you have to hit. You care a lot about, you really want to know what the relationship between inputs and outputs are, like between effort and reward. Like you want to know that if I do this, then I get that, right? And people like that who, you know, keep lists and, you know, are, you know, who, you know, finish their assignments early. Those are like, these are people who get good grades, but that is a certain kind of conservatism. And that is the kind of conservatism that, insofar as there is any, kind of dominates in the academy, because the professors are all A students who tend to be high in conscientiousness because you don't finish grad school. Like I didn't finish grad school because I'm super low in conscientiousness. I had too many incomplete papers, right? Like people who don't have incomplete papers, those are high conscientiousness people. But you can be super high in openness and also super high in conscientiousness. These are independent things, and they kind of pull in slightly different directions. All right, so you see lots of interesting, I was like, are there just sort of direct relationships between these things? Well, some of this work, you know, shows that, you know, mostly I look at openness because that's the strongest correlation. And openness is really heavily correlated with urbanization. And this gives you a, you know, just a kind of a schematic look of that. Not always, like, you know, Montana, I don't know what's going on there exactly. But you know, the coastal cities, Texas is super urbanized, Florida is super urbanized. These are still majority Republican, but there's a lot of high openness because they got really big urban populations. This is Chicago sticking out of the Midwest. Northeast is really urbanized. Now, one of the things that I became really interested in is, you know, just whether, when you're thinking about, you know, the magnets being drawn to the city, is there just a relationship between openness to experience and your propensity to migrate at all? And it turns out there is. There's a little literature on this, and it makes sense. So like lower openness, you know, I talked more about high openness before, but lower openness, what that is about is you really like familiarity. You really like a sense of rootedness, right? It's like people who care a lot about family, their community, their church, and they like cherish this stability and rootedness. And like basically a low openness person is going to be a better friend. But like when people talk about rootless cosmopolitans, like that's high openness. And you're flaky. Like high openness people don't call their parents, right? Like low openness people call their parents because like those, you know, unselected relationships are incredibly meaningful to them. So lower openness people, like it's like, it hurts to leave your hometown. right? Like you've got people there, you've got a church, you've got a family, like that's, all of those things give meaning to your life. And just new things you find a little bit alienating. Like you want your kids to play with the same toys that you played with when you were a kid. Like you want, you know, prom to be the same for your kids as it was for you. You like that stability over generations. There's tons of country songs about this. Like, you know, I got married to my wife and now my daughter is getting married and we're all crying, you know, like, it's just like, I wrote a blog post about that years ago. And that one of the main guys who like, Jason Renfro at Cambridge, who does a lot of this, he also does personality and music. And there's a connection between like lower openness people love country music, higher openness people like complicated experimental stuff, or, you know, so it just comes out in a lot of different ways. So like, you know, pop country is, you know, music for low openness people. And it's always about like the first time you know, your first kiss by the creek, and, you know, like the time you won the football game or something like that. I'm not a low openness person, so I clearly I'm out of my element talking about it. All right, so when you get into the city, you get correlations. It's just everywhere. The main guy who does this stuff, as I was saying, is this guy Jason Renfro at Cambridge. Still, nobody's done a similar thing in the US, but here's a nice comparison of just the population density of city and the distribution of openness to experience in London. This is London, right? You can just see higher density, higher openness. That's really interesting when openness correlates with ideology and partisanship. Like, and some of this, now, a lot of times, one of the mistakes people make when they start to see this divide, there was a book a few years ago called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, and like sometimes this kind of gave the impression that the country is becoming segregated on ideology and partisanship because like Democrats want to live near Democrats and Republicans want to live near Republicans, and there's a tiny amount of evidence for just like a little bit of that. But like, for the most part, it has nothing to do with it. It's just that the personality traits that relate to political preferences also predict residential preferences. And so they are, you know, they correlate with one another. And so here's like a Pew survey that shows just like where different kind of people like to live. Really liberal people like places where houses are smaller and close to each other. You can walk to stuff. And it just kind of goes the way you'd expect. Like the most conservative people like places that are houses that are farther apart. They like places that have big churches, lots of parking. And they like those things independently of their political preferences. It's just the same attributes predict both of those things. All right. I don't have many slides on this one, but last I want to talk about education. And I think this has mostly like, this gets into the division of the country in economic terms. So over time, as we transition from a rural agricultural economy to a more urban manufacturing economy, then finally to an information economy, the economic returns to education kept getting higher and higher and higher because the work gets more and more cognitively complex. So knowledge workers, information workers, like it takes a lot of training to know how to program a computer or just manage a large corporation. And so education creates a strong economic incentive to urbanize, right? Because if the wage premium to education keeps going up, but all the jobs are concentrated in the cities, then you have to move to a city to collect the education bonus, right? It's hard to get like these days I do government affairs for a big fintech company. And like those jobs don't exist in Iowa, right? Like they exist in California. And so if you want to do that kind of thing, you're going to have to move to cities. But that has a really significant effect over time. Like I use my own hometown as an example, Marshalltown, Iowa. When I was a kid, I didn't know it. But like when we moved there, my family, we moved there from Missouri when I was like 4 or 5 in 1978. Like that was like the peak of that place. Like it peaked. And so like I lived there during its heyday. It was great. And there were a bunch of like small manufacturers. There's, you know, like Lennox Heating and Cooling, they make air conditioners. You know, there's a place that makes trowels. Marshalltown Trowel is the leading trowel company. If you ever see somebody laying bricks, might be using a Marshalltown trowel. And there's the biggest employer is a place called Fisher Controls that makes valves and governors that you wouldn't know about, but they're super important to lots and lots of systems. And around when I, you know, got into college, those jobs started leaving to go to Mexico or China or places where labor costs were much, much lower. But like those higher complexity manufacturing, like the line jobs aren't that complicated. Like if you're just like making air conditioners, there's lots of jobs for people without college degrees, but the factory needs like lawyers and regulatory compliance people and like managers. So there's a whole bunch of more highly educated people. And as those companies left, in order to just maintain your income, people with a higher level of education had to move to at least to Des Moines or to Iowa City, one of the bigger places. And so all of those towns started to experience brain drain. But like over time, economic productivity is more and more correlated with the average level of education in a place. So as the average level of education goes down, productivity goes down. And that's partly what you're seeing in those charts where like Hillary Clinton won many fewer counties than Al Gore, but they still were more productive. That's just the economy getting more and more concentrated because the educated population has become more and more concentrated. And the result of that is that there is like becomes a really strong correlation between basically poverty and low density. So here is a very complicated chart that like I used to write for the New York Times and I convinced their graphics guy to do this. You can't read these very well, but these are all the counties in the US. And the bigger bubbles are the bigger counties. So this one right here, this is us. This is Los Angeles County. And this is more and less dense. And this is like an index of economic vitality, like which isn't just economic growth, it's like employment and a lot of other things. And there's just like this really strong correlation between democratic counties and economic vitality. And this is like the zero line. This is negative economic vitality. This is a lot of counties. And they're almost all Republican. There's a lot of these smaller cities that are below the line that are still heavily Democratic. And those are Rust Belt places like Pittsburgh or Cleveland, places that are kind of down on their luck economically, like history's kind of passed them by. And so they're not doing great economically, but they're still pretty liberal. And so you get a lot of depressed places with extremely conservative people who feel like, if I'd stayed in my hometown, I would like, why has this place gone to shit? Because it really has, right? Like it was a really nice place when I was a kid, and now it's just like kind of like semi-impoverished, like that, closed stores downtown, just everything seems ramshackle, things aren't getting repainted, and it's just poorer than it was. The crime rate's higher than it was. And you're like, why have things gone to crap? And you look at these cities and they're so rich, and you're just like, they must have fucked us over, right? Like that's kind of like this really simple answer. And then over time, as people keep sorting themselves on personality attributes, and on these economic attributes like education, the people who are left in all of these counties, they get more and more conservative over time. So the percentage of people who are low in openness to experience gets stronger and stronger, right? Like over time, like people who are on the fence kind of get picked off and go to the city, and like some of them leave. So the people who are really adamant about staying are the most conservative people, and low openness strongly correlates with what I mentioned earlier, high ethnocentrism, a strong preference for living around people like you. So people who are low in openness really dislike diversity. They don't want to live around people who don't look like them or eat what they eat, right? Like there's a lot of really low openness African Americans and, you know, Vietnamese, but like they don't have a choice, right? Like they might prefer to live in the country. They don't really like the diversity of the city either, but their ethnocentric preference is so strong that they just have to live in the city because that's where the other, you know, Koreans are. But white people, if you're highly ethnocentric, you have a choice. You can not move to a city, right? And so over time, it's basically the rural population gets more and more ethnocentric. And that for me is like a big part of the explanation of why that group of people was able to be consolidated as a block now when they couldn't even in 1980, like Pat Buchanan tried, you know, Ron Paul kind of tried, but like it didn't work. It took this level of kind of filtering to create this increasingly homogeneous non-urban community. And one of the just suggestive things about that you see is that they really, all of those places really have become much more alike. Accents have become more alike, which is a strange thing. There's a kind of like general rural accent now, which is kind of placeless. When I was a kid, the Minnesota rural accent, the Iowa rural accent, and the Missouri rural accent were all a little bit different, but they're not now. It's the same accent. And you see Confederate battle flags in Minnesota and Oregon and Maine, places that like have no relationship to the Confederacy, and those are just symbols of white supremacy. Like, and it's a group of highly ethnocentric white people who are really identifying with their ethnicity in a way that they hadn't before. And that seems ironic that that would be finally successful in 2016, because overall, our population is less racist than it's ever been. Right? If you just, whatever the measures of, you know, like how many people approve or disapprove of interracial relationships, like how much does it bother you if your, you know, kid marries somebody who doesn't have the same religion, all those things. Like we've gotten much more tolerant and open over time in the aggregate. But those, you know, exurban rural communities have become increasingly ethnocentric and easy to activate on using kind of like ethnic scaremongering. So like the build the wall stuff, you know, the invasion of, you know, immigrants are invading, all of that stuff is just whipping up ethnocentric negativity toward outgroups. And you see, and I'll end here because I think our time's about up. Well, one thing I wanted to mention is that you see a similar pattern all over the world. And and this is one of the reasons I think why there's been this surge of kind of populist nationalism everywhere. It's happened in Europe, it's happened in Asia, it's happened in North America, it's happened in Canada. Like you saw that trucker rally, that's the same kind of thing. Because, and you would expect to see it because this is a very general explanation. It's urbanization generally. You're going to get the same filtering effects. You know, you saw the graphs of the UK, right? Like the Brexit vote share is just, you know, really strongly correlated with high and low openness to experience. And so we're getting that kind of dynamic over and over again. Now, this makes me kind of pessimistic because it's a structural thing. It's not about people who disagree with each other across partisan lines aren't talking to each other and trying to understand each other, right? Like that's true, they're not, but I think that's a consequence of this deeper structural shift. And in the United States, I don't really know what the solution to it is. We have a specific issue that is grounded in the fact that our Constitution was written in the 1780s for an agricultural, country, and gives weight to land, basically. And that's why you can, win an election with a minority of the population. And when Republicans have, won elections with minorities, they do a lot of things to try to consolidate their, pre-existing structural advantages. Then they try to gerrymander the maps. They do all sorts of, things to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to vote, and to try to lock in their advantage, because they know that demographically they're getting eclipsed. But it doesn't show up electorally necessarily because the low density bonus in the American electoral system is so strong. And in fact, like, liberals who live in big dense cities, they're kind of like, we gerrymander ourselves. Like, when you're doing gerrymandered maps, they call it packing and cracking. Well, we're packing. And so it's really easy to make legislative districts where like you've got, 48%, you just draw a line into the city and then a huge shape outside of it. And you can just divide up that constituency like 10 ways because we're so packed in. It's harder for Democrats to draw such outrageous maps because the Republicans are spread out so much more. And so the conclusion I draw in this paper is that our best hope for depolarization is structural political change. We need a new Voting Rights Act that makes it basically constitutionalizes the right to vote and does things like just registers you automatically, create a holiday on voting days where everybody gets out of work, things that kind of offset some of the structural advantage that that benefits the lower density party. But in the absence of that, it's hard to see where it goes because we're seeing it today. In the last year, every single state has passed a ton of new voting laws that make it harder and harder for mostly Democratic people to vote. And Republicans who are elected by minorities have succeeded in filling the Supreme Court. So even when Democrats do make favorable changes, things that help their party in general, they're more likely to get knocked down. And so I think it's really dire. I don't think there's really a way out of it other than structural changes that make it so that the majority of the population actually wins elections. And then if the Republican Party actually has to, in order to be competitive, they would have to win voters inside the outer suburbs. They would have to appeal to at least some urban constituencies. And that means that they have to get more suburban college-educated voters. They need to get more non-white voters. And any gesture that they make in that direction moderates the party, right? And so that's where kind of moderation and depolarization would come from, I think. It's nice if people talk to each other, but I think you just have to change the law. Okay, if we have any time for questions, I talked right up past my time, but I'm happy to take some questions.